Hello, everyone. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, which is the parent company of the New York Jewish Week. On behalf of the UJA Federation, our partners in this Folio literary series, and the New York Jewish Week, I thank all of you for being here this evening. Tonight, we will be featuring Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove about his new published book, For Such a Time as This. Rabbi Cosgrove will be in conversation with my colleague at the New York Jewish Week, Andy Silow-Carroll. It is my great pleasure to welcome my rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue and dear friend to this space to explore what it means to be Jewish today. Andy, it is all yours.
Thank you, Thea, and thanks for joining us tonight for our conversation with Rabbi Cosgrove. I'll give a brief introduction because I really want to get to this conversation. We have a lot to talk about. Rabbi Cosgrove is a leading voice in the conservative movement. He's the rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue, one of New York's major pulpits, and one that was filled in the past by some real leading lights of the movement, including Rabbi Milton Steinberg, Rabbi Judah Nadich, and Rabbi David Lincoln. His new book, For Such a Time as This, I'll say this, it's a slim book, but it is packed with ideas about Jewish vulnerability, the trauma of October 7th, the obligations of Jewish peoplehood, the failures of some leaders, and the Torah that inspires and challenges Rabbi Cosgrove and his congregants. So, Rabbi, thank you for joining us on this evening.
Andy, thank you so much for the warm welcome, and Thea and the whole team at 70 Faces. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I think we should start by acknowledging the big news today, which is the hostage and ceasefire agreement. If it's signed, if it's ratified, it'll see Israeli forces withdraw to the east. Hostages would be released over the course of 42 days. Palestinian prisoners would be released, and there's going to be a surge of humanitarian supplies, we're told, into Gaza. I just wanted to get your reaction to the deal, not so much as a political commentator, but, as a Jew who's just, been really affected by the events of the last 15 months.
Yeah, I think that is the news of the day and much more than the day. It's 468 days since the horrors of October 7th, and that has been traumatic for all of us here in the States, but even more so for the state of Israel, the people of Israel, certainly the hostage families, and the hostages most of all. So the very thought that perhaps, and, that, this deal, please God, should go through and these hostages should see light of day. I was speaking with a few rabbinic colleagues about what you're going to do, how you're going to react, what the announcement's going to be, and I made the decision. I said, I have nothing to celebrate until I see the hostages on the other side of safety. We've had too many moments where we've come so close only to see our hopes dashed. So if the hostages come, if there's a ceasefire, if there can be a cessation, a pause in hostilities, I think that bodes well. But any brachas, any benching gomel, thanking God for saving lives, thanking Israel for making hard decisions, I think, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yeah, and we'll be reporting it when we do it as well. Your book is very much a reaction to October 7th and what we learned, what horrified you, what inspired you in the months since. Did your rabbinic experience in education prepare you for this moment, or were there revelations you could not have imagined before 15 months ago?
No, I think for me and for all of us, I think there's a before and after, and I don't think anything, right, neither COVID nor any other trauma of my career really prepared me for this moment. COVID was a global catastrophe and challenge, but this moment of October 7th of feeling that not just Israel, but the Jewish people had come under such an acute attack on October 7th really was, for all of us, I think, unprecedented in our lives. The idea that this has opened up a new and very dark chapter of our reality as lovers of Israel, as lovers of peace. This, has drawn on a whole new series of rabbinic skill sets that has been about community building, about advocacy, about finding a voice to speak, and as the book is called, in such a time as this. This is a moment that you just have to respond to with every bit, and hope that we can carry the day.
You write about, I mean, there's so many reactions I'm sure among your congregants, just as there are among our readers and friends. One thing that you write about is tribal awakening in the wake of the attacks. The campus backlash and the trauma felt by perhaps unengaged Jews, where they're maybe coming back to synagogue, maybe they're coming back to, Friday nights. Is that awakening real? And where were you seeing the evidence?
Yeah, the by any metric of Jewish life, as a congregational rabbi, I have seen some people call it the tribal moment, some people call it the surge, some people call it October 8th Jews, but I have seen it in tuchuses in the pews. I've seen it in advocacy. Everyone has become sort of an accidental advocate, a real sense of Jewish identity coming alive in the face of trauma. I'm a rabbi, so my texts are always based in Torah. I mean, this is a moment that I think about in this week's Torah reading, when Moses sees his Hebrew brethren being hit by the Egyptian taskmaster, and something's triggered within him at that moment that he identifies with his kinsman's condition. In the book, I make a distinction between what I call Genesis Jews and Exodus Jews. Genesis as defined by way of the initial call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, go forth to be a blessing, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed by you. This is a positive assertion of Jewish identity, the riches of what it means, the positive pull of what it is to be a Jew. An Exodus identity is actually situated in this week's Parsha, that a new king arises over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The Jewish people, the Hebrews at the time, were considered other. They were a threat, perhaps a fifth column from within, and therefore needed to be oppressed and ultimately enslaved. That identity, it's not perfect. There's Exodus elements in Genesis and Genesis elements in Exodus, but the idea that Jewish identity can also be defined by others in a negative, the push of being othered by society at large. Jews, American Jews, may or may not have defined themselves as Genesis Jews prior to October 7th, but on October 7th, we all became Exodus Jews. We all felt that the attacks of October 7th were not just on Israelis, not just on, they were attacks against humanity, but it was really a moment where we all said, whoa, wait a second, who are these defining us through the negative? Of course, a challenge, and maybe we'll get into this in our conversation, is how to be eyes wide open to what it means to be an Exodus Jew, but never let the hatreds of others define who we are.
I think we can talk about that now, but we'll ease into that. How's that?
Yeah.
There's another text that I think is very important. It gave the book its title. It comes from the book of Esther, the Purim story, and you expand on the idea of what you call an Esther moment.
Correct.
What does the Esther story have to teach American Jews at this juncture?
So the story of Esther that we read on Purim is really the biblical spine of this book. And what I describe is that the template of what Esther goes through is a way to understand what American Jewry is going through or has gone through. That in the book of Esther, they're living in a diaspora community. Her name itself, Esther, means to hide. She believed herself to be able to assimilate successfully into Persian society. The going was good. She actually entered into the palace. She rose up to the rank of queen in the house of Ahasuerus. And everything was fine up until that moment that Haman's wicked decree came down and the fate of the Jews was on the line. At that moment, by way of an emissary, Esther's uncle Mordecai calls out to Esther and says, don't think that you're going to escape the decree of Haman. Who knows if it was not for such a time as this, the title of the book, that you've arrived at your royal station. And Esther responds to this moment, and she responds as a woman, as a queen, and most of all as a Jew, and the fate of the Jewish people takes a turn for the better, and we're saved. That story, I think, not so different than the Egyptian sojourn, but speaks to the American story. That I think that the story of the last 70 years of American Jewish life, you can start the clock post-war, you can start when it's suburbanization and otherwise, this belief that as American Jews we could elide the differences between our Jewish selves and our American selves and blend in successfully into American society. The idea that there were stories of anti-Semitism in the old world. We know what's going on in Europe and elsewhere, but somehow we believed that the American story was a different story, that we were the exception to the rule. And then what happened on October 7th was this awakening, this sense of whiplash, that what we believe to be so is not so, that our American setting is not as hospitable to us as we like, because of course, what happened was in Israel on October 7th, but the moment when the attacks against the Jewish people were flipped to thrust the victim into an aggressor role happened instantaneously at that moment. And we felt that it wasn't just our attachment to Israel that was on the line, but our very Jewishness was on the line, with the pernicious and blurred line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And so that story of Esther ultimately also, because Esther rose up. And so all of these stories that we're talking about people stepping up as advocates, philanthropy, solidarity missions, getting involved politically, connecting with their Jewish identities in a way that hitherto they hadn't, this has really been the thousands, millions of Esther moments, right? And they happen. I'm a congregational rabbi, Andy, and I can talk about numbers, about philanthropy and things like that. But what has been most moving to me have been the stories that have happened in the rabbi's office, right? The young couple in an interfaith relationship that they've been on the fence about the question of conversion or living an active Jewish life, and they walk into my office and they say, now's the time to engage, that the trauma hasn't thrust them away from their Jewish identity, but it's actually prompted them to get more engaged. Young families, teenagers in their secular schools who are asking all sorts of questions about what Judaism means to me. I mean, a million Esther moments that I can track, the quiet ones being the most moving of all.
There's a negative, troubling aspect to the book of Esther, which you describe in the book, which comes way at the end, sometimes in a chapter that we don't even read, especially to kids. And I'm thinking about the misuses and abuses of vengeance. And I want to talk about that because I think that would have been a natural reaction.
There's an underbelly to the book of Esther, all right? And we say everyone lives happily ever after. We dress our kids as Vashti or as Esther and Gay Gesund. But that's not as you're correctly pointing out, chapter 9 of the book of Esther has a very dark chapter where the Jews take vengeance against those who would be their persecutors in a very vicious and gruesome way that, as you correctly point out, we usually don't write sermons about or add in our Purim plays and our synagogue productions. This thread, which scholars talk about as sort of this gruesome fantasy of what we would do were we to be an empowered state over our oppressors has been operationalized by some of the most extreme elements of the Jewish community. I remember being in Israel, and I talk about this in the book, the moment when Baruch Goldstein entered into the cave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs in Hebron and killed, I think it was 29 worshipers on that dark day. The day that he did that was Purim. And he did that not because he felt that it was a fantasy image, but he believed that this was the commandment to take vengeance against those enemies of the Jewish people. Now, Baruch Goldstein was inspired by a Kahanist, Meir Kahana's ideology that had this vengeful, aggressive, extremist view of the use and ultimately the abuse of Jewish power, so much so that in his day, Kahana was outlawed by Shimon Peres, who incidentally was not a left-leaning minister, but he was beyond the pale of Israeli discourse. The coda, which should frighten us all, is that those who would characterize themselves as descendants, as products of Kahanist ideology are no longer not just outlawed in Israel, but they are actually sitting members of the ruling coalition. So that extremist ideology has wound itself into present-day Israeli politics. So it's something that should concern us all.
I want to pick up on something else you said in talking about Esther moments, the quiet moments when people came to your office and wanted to, re-engage or go deeper or to convert. What about the opposite? Are there people who said, what's happening there now, I can't stomach, or I feel too vulnerable as a Jew, I'm going to pull back because it's just too difficult? Does that happen? And what do you say to folks like that?
Look, I know the people who walk into the rabbi's office. So the folk who walk into the rabbi's office are by definition people who are leaning into their Jewish identity, leaning out, not leaning out. I do believe that there are folk who are probably far more circumspect about public declarations, assertions, associations with Israel, the Jewish people, for reasons of safety and security. And that are young families. These are also very difficult moments that I experience as a rabbi when a young family says, I get into a taxi after the early childhood program and my kid is singing the Shabbat songs, and I'm well aware of what my surroundings. Is it okay to wear a yarmulke? Is it okay to have a Magen David? Is it okay to sing those, Shabbat Baba songs, out publicly in the street? So I've had many of those conversations with young families as they're asking very difficult, raw, honest questions about how to parent in a time like this. There is a whole nother question, which I imagine we'll get to, which is the generational question, which is a totally different question about how closely we can align ourselves with the condition of Israel and Israelis if we're not aligned with the decisions of the Israeli government. But I imagine that's somewhere in your list of questions.
Well, there's a important chapter in your book where you talk to a young woman you call Maya,
Yeah.
a friend of your daughter, and she basically is an anti-Zionist, like a lot of not like a good number of young people have become, or if not since October 7th and generationally. And she challenged you, I think, saying that I guess Israel wasn't meeting her moral expectations.
Yeah.
So why should it be at the center of her Judaism? And I think you have a response to her. Maybe you can summarize and tell me, does it still feel like a satisfying response?
Look, the history will judge how well we've bridged this moment between the generations. I think it's a little too early to tell, but I think the fact of the matter is that what's gone on in Israel has been a subplot, if you will, is it's been received differently by different generations, broad brushstrokes, Gen X and beyond, and the Gen Z generation. So Maya, this chapter I have on Maya, not her real name, really did grow up in my household. I joke she shares half a brain with my own children, and at any given time of day or night could be sitting at my kitchen table. And one day she approached me and said, you know, Rabbi Cosgrove, which is not what she calls me, so I knew it was a serious conversation. Is this, why do you have an Israeli flag on your pulpit? Why do you say the prayer for the state of Israel in the midst of the service? These are national statements. I don't want my Judaism to be, you know, so tightly connected to the decisions of the Israeli government, which, as you correctly describe, are not simpatico with her views, her universal American Jewish values. Now, I do want to say Maya and the Mayas of the world, in this case, there are those who hate Israel. In this case, she is just, given her Jewish background, her immersion in Jewish day school, Israel programs, right? She's done all the right things. Her parents have invested not a small sum of money in her Jewish education, but her universal sensibility isn't aligned with that of a right-leaning Israeli government. You can't blame someone for when they're born, right? My points of reference are by definition different than hers. She only has a world where Netanyahu, if you were born in 2002, Netanyahu is the only prime minister that you know. Israel is the Goliath to the Palestinian David. Israel has an expansionist policy in the West Bank and otherwise. So that is her reality. At that moment, when confronted by the questions of the Maya generation, my tactic, and this is actually playing out amongst me and my colleagues right now, do you push them outside of the tent or do you bring them in? I think the Jewish community made a mistake along the way, what I call the OJC, the Organized Jewish Community, in the sense that we substituted support for the Israeli government with Jewish identity. Arthur Hertzberg of blessed memory once said that the only thing you could get excommunicated from within the Jewish community is dissent with the Israeli government. And so when we created that construct for the very best reasons, but that construct left little room for the person who wanted a vibrant Jewish life, but found themselves at odds with the policies of this or that Israeli government. So I think the response is to listen, to ask probing questions. Okay, Maya, you don't believe in nationalism, you don't believe in the policies of the Israeli government, but then ask, well, what do you suggest for the safety and security of 47% of the Jewish people who live in a location that's surrounded by an Iranian ring of fire, with the stated purpose of repeating October 7th again and again and again? And then do the most important thing of all, stop talking. Let that young mind construct their own response that is eyes wide open to the threats that Israel faces, and yet also seeking to construct a language by which they can have empathy for the other in light of Israel's very real needs. What I don't think will happen is, what certainly hasn't happened to me, is that the Mayas of the world will say, you know what, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm glad we had this debate, let's go our separate ways. But what I do think will happen is that the Mayas of the world will think twice before they return to campus and stand next to someone in an encampment that says, with a placard that says, from the river to the sea. That they'll be more intentional and self-aware about using their Jewish selves side by side with those who would seek the destruction of the Jewish state. And so I look long on the Mayas of the world. I think that they're our future, and to write them off is making an egregious mistake.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fair, by your own description, to call you maybe a liberal Zionist. You support religious pluralism in Israel, efforts to achieve Arab-Jewish coexistence, and steps towards a two-state solution. It's pretty much the parameters of liberal Zionism. I often say that that's one of the loneliest places to be right now, because the liberals don't want you to be Zionist, and the Zionists don't want you to be liberals. And I wonder if you see it that way. And how do you feel trying to hold together a kind of normative way of being Jewish, I think, and Zionist for your generation that may not have the same hold? Either people are moving farther to the right or farther to the left.
Look, that's what this book is all about. I mean, I wrote this book trying to prop up what I call a sane center, a voice within the Jewish community that's not beholden to the extremism on either side of the political divide. And so I think that we do have to find language that we can be both vigilant over Jewish concern, but also empathetic for the other, that we can be eyes wide open to what happened on October 7th and the desired intent to perpetrate such acts again, and also think actively about what is the day after. A Jewish voice that is able to be staunchly pro-Israel, but also be able to give voice to the fact that not every decision of this or that Israeli government is necessarily in the long-term interests of a Jewish democratic state as envisioned by the founding documents of the state. So is it a lonely place? Yeah, it's a lonely place. Right now, I just came back from Israel last week. The Israeli left, as you and I might know it from Oslo days, is dead. I grew up in a moment of time full of hope and a promise under Yitzhak Rabin and otherwise that maybe there was this sort of two-state world that Jews and Palestinians could live side by side in safety and self-determination. That's a pipe dream right now. The question is, with that dream so far in the distance, and with the modest position that American Jewry plays in this unfolding drama, what is the position of to take right now? And I'm sticking by my liberal Zionism. I think that as long as Jews have been Jews, we've fought for things, whether or not we realize the fruits of those hopes in our lifetime or not. Moses set out on the promised land, whether or not he himself got it. Jeremiah and Ezekiel sought to return to the land, whether or not they were going to get there. For thousands of years, Jews longed for a promise of Zion next year in Jerusalem, whether or not it was realized. So for me to imagine a world where Jews and Palestinians can live side by side, yeah, it's a pipe dream. It's certainly a pipe dream given the climate right now. But I can't imagine living a life that's anything other than guided by the principles that I believe in, and to plant seeds towards making those dreams happen to the best of my ability.
Mm-hmm. So I want to take this moment to tell our viewers, if you do have a question for Rabbi Cosgrove, you can drop it into the chat, and we will get to as many as we can over the next 25 minutes or so. I want to ask about your trip to Israel. I'm sure you go many times a year, but how was this one different? What did you see? What was the mood?
Yeah, it was a tough trip. I have to say, it was a tough trip. I mean, the news has changed today as you opened the program with the hostages, but I went on when I was at a rally, it was very interesting because here in America, when you go to a rally asking for the hostages to be released, the rally is clearly a pro-Israel rally. When you're in Israel, to call for the hostages to be released was perceived as an anti-government statement. So there's a different paradigm in Israel at work, and you can be at a rally calling for the hostages. Yuval Shoham, who died in a military accident in Gaza, he was mourned. So in one and the same breath, Israelis are supporting the work of the IDF, mourning the loss of the soldiers, also protesting the government. So it's a mistake for American Jews to impose their own sensibility on Israel in a one-to-one correspondence. The actual trip that I was on was called Encounter, and I don't want to turn this into a commercial, but you asked me the question about it, which is American Jews engaged in dialogue with Palestinians and Israelis. What made this trip different was the dialogue was happening not just with American Jews, Palestinians, and Israelis, but these were Jewish communal professionals, rabbis, educators, heads of not-for-profits, that we were talking to them, we were listening to them, we were hearing their various stories, and we were doing it with our college-age or graduate school-age children. So it was a fascinating intergenerational moment where we, with the Maya generation, were engaged in this dialogue. I have to say what was most depressing, and I spoke about this past Shabbat in synagogue, was the hermetically sealed worlds of the Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis, and I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes, I didn't speak with every Israeli, there's very little room in the Israeli psyche to feel empathy for the plight of Gaza right now. It's seen as a just war and react to the trauma of October 7th. And we know this as human beings. When you yourself are in pain, you don't want to worry about the pain of the other. There was one head of the protest movement who we asked, this Israeli, we said, how do you make sense of the tens of thousands of Palestinians who have been killed in Gaza? And he said, give me back the hostages and then I'll worry about what's going on in Gaza. And then on the Palestinian side, you have a similar sort of internal loop, because the Palestinians, if they agree to acknowledge the horror of October 7th, which they don't necessarily do, they see it as another chapter in a long-standing cycle of violence, justifying the acts of October 7th, which have long since been eclipsed by the trauma of Gazan communities. And so they're not interested in facing the real trauma that Israelis are feeling right now. So you have these two communities, Israelis and Palestinians, who are not at all communicating, tapped into each other's pain, and they're certainly not, if they're not willing to acknowledge that, interested in digging themselves out of a hole. So you asked me how it was. I can't say it was good. I think that there are really two communities speaking way past each other, and it's a very tough moment.
Mm-hmm. It's something you write about two other communities that are speaking past each other in your book, which is the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. I wonder if that was part of your trip. Did you get a sense of what the two sides want from each other? Is there a distance right now? They're feeling something that American Jews can't possibly imagine, and vice versa?
Look, sociologically, we're 70 odd years into the establishment of the State of Israel. We're in a moment of time where two distinct Jewish communities have emerged. And, and what I do in the book is I unpack why this is so, that American Jewry has emerged aligned with a sense of, American liberalism, and Israelis who are in the Middle East, not the Upper East Side, have a more shields up, insular view of us and them. So that sociologists can explain as the natural thing when two communities grow up, not one to the other. The question is, do we have anything to talk about one to the other anymore, American Jews in Israel? And I tell the story in the book, and it was a very raw story that was experienced by my daughter, who grew up in Jewish day school, grew up going to Jewish summer camp, grew up with every message saying that her Jewish identity was a Jewish identity with Israel at the center. And like a nice Jewish kid, she went on a gap year, in Hebrew, a Mechina year, in order to live amongst Israelis in Tel Aviv. And she was so disillusioned when she realized that though she grew up thinking that her Jewish identity was tied in to the condition of Israel and Israelis, the typical secular Israeli spends zero psychic energy on the condition of American Jewry or global Jewry. And then you stick that kid on a college campus where that kid is expected to defend the decisions of an Israeli government with whose policy she is not aligned with. And so that distancing right? You can trace it, you can track it. And I think that's one of the things that this experience of encounter was trying to address, this sort of the lack of communication between young American Jews and the Israel of the moment.
I just, technical question, were you able to get into the West Bank this time?
We were not, on a prior encounter trip that I was on. We actually went in. There was a home hospitality program that we actually stayed with Palestinian families. There was actual violence in both directions last week. You saw in the news. So it was not a moment that we could go deep into Palestinian communities. So we met with a wonderful organization called Shorashim, where there are Arabs and Jews who are working to find, some silver linings in the clouds of conflict right now. We met with a few people. We met with a former mayor of a settlement. So we met with different folk, but not in the same way. Just it was understandable given what's going on right now.
Yeah, yeah. I misspoke before for our viewers. If you want to leave a question, put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. That won't work for you. Another thing about the kind of relationship between American Jewry and Israel. You write, I think you quote Arthur Hertzberg again on the American religion, that Judaism, that Zionism became, especially, that same period you're talking about, post-war, post-suburbanization. You write that Judaism isn't Zionism and Zionism isn't Judaism, although you are deeply invested in both. And you also make explicit, I think, that Judaism is, without religion, is a dead end in terms of passing down Jewishness to one or two generations. So tell me about, because I think this is a big part of your book, about your call for restoring, I think, what you call the religion of Judaism.
Yeah. So look, I can tell this story in many different ways, but it's really the story of American Jewry, that a civic religion grew, which was engagement with Israel. I think we're about 100 years since the founding of the first Hadassah hospital in Jerusalem. And I raise that just as an interesting point, because what Henrietta Zold did is she created a movement to support the nascent state of Israel, the Yishuv, which served the purposes of the pre-state Jewish community, but it also provided an organizing principle by which American Jews could be proud Jews in a civic, religious sort of way. And that was not just nice, that was critically important for the establishment of the State of Israel. But as you said, and Arthur Hertzberg wrote at some length about, this civic religion became a substitute faith for American Jews, and in a way it became an orthodoxy of American Jews, that a threshold of loyalty was your allegiance to the policies of the State of Israel. And I think that was a wrong turn. Now, let me just state very clear, because this is a public conversation, that for me, my Jewish identity and Jewish self is part and parcel with my connection to the people and the state of Israel. To not be engaged with the condition of the Jewish people in the state of Israel is an abdication of Jewish identity. I believe that very strongly. Having said that, my Zionism is not my Judaism, and my Judaism is not my Zionism. They are connected but distinct aspects of my being. And so for me, I went to rabbinical school, and I didn't become a professional at APAC or J Street or ZOA. For me, my vocational goal of my life is to bring people closer to Torah, to Tefillah, to Masim Tovim, to good deeds, to the riches of an incredible tradition that forms community identity and teaches us to become the people that we aspire to be, but sometimes fall short of. This is what it means to be a rabbi. This is what it means to be a vital, engaged Jew. And so one of the challenges of this moment for me and for other rabbis is we have become de facto advocates for the Jewish state by dint of being congregational rabbis. But we went to rabbinical school because we want people to light Shabbos candles and to study Torah and to engage in mitzvot. And so we have to learn to walk and chew gum at this moment because we have to be eyes wide open to the real threats that Israel faces, but we can't fall into the trap of essentializing who we are to the latest news story when it comes to Israel. We need to bring people back to tradition. That's why I became a rabbi, and that's what I'm sticking with.
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression, by the way, that your book is only a reaction to October 7th. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot going on in people's psyches right now that don't only have to do with Israel. And I'm just, what kind of case do you make for the needs that are fulfilled by, the lighting candles, keeping Shabbat, being part of a community? How do you make that case when it's not a time of crisis?
Look, I think that there are certain essential questions that sit on the human soul, and that we put our heads on our pillows at night, and we all think about them at some point in our lives, about what does it mean to live a moral life? What is my connection to the generations that precede me and that, please God, will extend past me? How do I balance my particular identity with my commitments to a universal humanity? How can I be religiously alive but also intellectually rigorous, right? These are the questions that animate my soul, and I think the toolbox, if you will, of Yiddishkeit, of Jewish practice, of ritual, of study, of community building are the ways that I feel blessed. They're not the only ways, right? I'm not a triumphalist when it comes to tradition. I think God speaks in many languages to humanity, and humanity speaks in many languages to God. But Judaism is my toolbox, and gosh, I'm lucky. And so if I have this opportunity to teach that, which is what being a rabbi means, that the riches of bringing people together for a Shabbat meal, to find sacred space in the frenetic pace of their week, to believe, as Heschel taught, that in the performance of a mitzvah, it's a place where heaven and earth kiss. These are very powerful ideas that have not run their course. I think they are still compelling to the searching Jewish soul today, if not more so today. I think to be part of a community of prayer in a time where we're all sort of, subject, to our iPhones and, automated, individualistic state of being. I think these are incredibly countercultural and therefore incredibly compelling concepts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. That was beautiful. I want to turn to some questions from viewers now, and I'll, they're all softballs like this one.
Well, give me some hard ones.
What are you telling college kids who are going off to some of the the campuses that might have a lot of strife? What do you tell them about what they should know, how they should react, how they should be Jewish on campus?
It goes directly to what we're talking about. I think we need a Marshall Plan to restore Jewish identity. I think that the case statement for a sovereign Jewish state, for Jewish self-determination, I think it's seen in the coin of the day as sort of this colonialist project, and I think a post-World War II endeavor or otherwise. And I think that the first thing when it comes to Israel specifically is to give our kids the tools. There are programs by way of 70 Faces and otherwise, that kids can be empowered to know the story of their own people and to be self-advocates of their story. That's number one. Number two is, I think, as I've hopefully made an impassioned case, that the day-to-day policies of this or that Israeli government doth not equal their Jewish identity. I think we need to send them off as proud Jews, as engaged Jews, as literate and as loving Jews. And I think that's a responsibility of Jewish educators like myself to do that. The third thing, which might be slightly more controversial, I don't know about to you, but maybe to some of the listeners, is that I think we need to know that, empowered as they are with their own story, they need to know the counter narrative. Hertzberg seems to be getting a lot of play in this conversation. He once said, you can't affirm your own certainties without engaging with the counter certainties of the other. So I don't only think that it's okay, I think it's responsible education to teach our children before they go out to college that your version of history of the state of Israel is going to be different than some of those people that you engage with on a college campus. And to empower that child with that counter narrative is not only okay, but it's actually the responsible thing to do before they hear it in a much more hostile environment once they've left home.
There are two questions that are similar here, and this is all kidding aside, these are difficult. One asks about Israel's military actions in Gaza. Do you feel they're justifiable? You probably don't use the word genocide, but do you feel they're justifiable and proportionate? And the questioner and another questioner asks a similar question, which is, how do you engage with Israel, but if that's something that bothers you, in a critical way? Is it possible to be still engaged and still be critical of the government, of the military, of what's happening right now on the ground?
Yeah. So they're connected, they're interconnected, and I think to the second question, absolutely. I think there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the streets at any given Saturday night who, as an expression of their love of Israel, are protesting the decisions of the Israeli government. I think that's also part of this Maya generation conversation, that to tell a young person that somehow it's taboo to express dissent with the Israeli government, when that is happening actively in Israel as an expression of people's love of country, it's just an argument that doesn't hold anymore. If you remember, prior to October 7th, the big story of 2023 was the protests on the judicial reform front. There you had Israelis pouring out in the street against the Israeli government because they wanted Israel to be true to the Jewish democratic principles of its founding document. So I think that one can, and I think we need to find the language by which we can express support for Israel, and at the same time be critical. I do think we need to be very intentional about this. One of the more juicy or controversial op-eds I wrote in the last year was when the Prime Minister was visiting D.C., and there were some left-leaning Jewish groups who were protesting Netanyahu's visit. And I wrote a thing in Haaretz, and I said, now is not the time to protest the Israeli Prime Minister, because whatever your personal feelings might be about the Prime Minister, you can't put your Jewish self next to someone burning an Israeli flag in public space at that moment. You want to protest Israel in a sea of Israeli flags that begins and ends with Hatikva, geh gesund, you should be well. But you have to be very judicious about how you position your Jewish voice next to those who seek Israel's destruction. As far as Gaza goes, I think we have to have empathy for the plight of Gaza. You might have heard Gilad Kariv's speech at the Knesset, right? All of Gaza are not accomplices in the misdeeds and the atrocities of October 7th. There are innocents, tens of thousands, who have been killed in this moment. Now, they have been killed because Israel has the right to defend itself, because Hamas embeds itself in hospitals and mosques and educational institutions, and the innocents of Gaza are victims of Hamas's nefarious tactics. And so I think we have to be able to mourn, to have empathy, to work actively towards a ceasefire, to defend Israel in the public sphere, to reject any language that comes close to genocide, which I think is totally ill-informed and inaccurate. And at the same time, we can and must mourn the loss of every Palestinian life.
So I think for what needs to, unfortunately needs to be the last question, I want to ask you about how you've changed over the last 15 months personally. And I'll ask this way. You can answer it any way you want, but I'm thinking, is there a Jewish text or any text, a song, a quotation, a poem, whose meaning changed for you? It used to mean something to you before this, and since in the last 15 months you say it very differently. Or is there a text that gave you solace or something meaningful that captured the moment?
It's a good question. I've done a lot of book talks. I've never been asked that question, so I'm just going to go close, and I'm going to go to, it's an Esther-like text, and I made mention of it, that when Moses saw his brethren being beaten in this week's Torah reading, that he said, the text says that he looked hither and yonder and didn't see anyone, and he protected the Israelite and struck down the Egyptian taskmaster. And Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the father, in sort of a knowing nod to this text, says, "B'makom she'eno ish yishadel liot ish," in a place where no one's being an upstander, strive to be an upstander. And I think for this moment, the Esther moments that I write about in my book, I think we need to take those uncomfortable leadership positions. That could be in journalism, that could be in philanthropy, that could be in advocacy, that could be in writing a book, that could be in standing in that uncomfortable position where we balance vigilance for our people with empathy for the other. These are not comfortable places to stand, but when we see that no one is standing in those places, the Jewish response is to stand in the breach. And so I think it's only when we enter not safe space, but brave space, to be that Esther, to be that Moses, to be that voice that is lonely, but principled. I think that's where we need to stand.
Well, I'm glad we were able to end on words of Torah. Thank you for that. The book is called For Such a Time as This, and we left a link in the chat where you can get it. I want to thank Rabbi Cosgrove. I also want to thank my colleagues at 70 Faces Media, Thea Wieseltier and Beryl Bessemer, and at UJA, our friends Susan Kahn and Graham Cannon. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night. And this is really a prayer more than anything else. Shalom.
Amen. Amen.